Fear Not, Episode 8. Hi, I'm Billy Atwell, and I believe that consistently facing your fears is the only way to realize your truest self and to make those confident choices that will help you to obtain your deepest held hopes and dreams. I have faith that this podcast series will show you that you are not alone, that it will strengthen you and give you courage to face your fears, and that it will help you to permanently cross over into a life of living beyond your fears. Join me on this journey as we listen and learn from others as they share their experiences in facing and overcoming their own fears. Hello, everybody. Today, you and I are going to be joined by Dr. John Arden. Welcome, Dr. Arden. Are you ready to fear not today?
I am. It's good to be with you.
Dr. Arden is the author of 14 books, including his most recent, Brain to Brain, The Brain Bible, as well as Rewiring Your Brain and Brain-Based Therapy with Adults and Brain-Based Therapy with Children and Adolescents. He is the Chief Academic Officer of the Brain Potential Institute, overseeing the development of training and practical neuroscience, previously serving as Director of Training and Mental Health for Kaiser Permanente in the Northern Californian region. He oversees the training programs in 24 medical centers where over 130 postdoctoral residents and interns are trained each year. Dr. Arden also provides individual, group, and family therapy and chemical dependency counseling through Kaiser Permanente. He has also presented workshops on brain-based therapy in over 23 countries and in all U.S. states. Dr. Arden has also written books on anxiety, OCD, PTSD, as well as Improving Your Memory for Dummies, Consciousness, Dreams, and Self, a Transdisciplinary Approach, winner of the Choice 1997 Outstanding Academic Book Award, and Science, Theology, and Consciousness. Dr. Arden, can you fill in the gaps and maybe give us a brief glimpse of your personal life?
Sure. I live in Northern California, about an hour north of San Francisco in West Sonoma County. And I'm very fortunate to be able to hike on the coast, several times a week, out above some incredibly beautiful cliffs overseeing the ocean. And that's one of my constant cravings, to be able to do that and go out into the fresh air and then get this amazing aerobic boost while looking at this spectacular scenery. I also love to travel around the world, and especially in third world countries, which is sort of like a good slap in the face to ensure that I don't get too complacent in my overly comfortable life here in this opulent environment. So I'm constantly reminding myself that I'm very fortunate, and that kind of gratitude, I think, is really important for people to, including myself, of course, to not get caught up in the latest worries or concerns about some little petty aspect of my life.
Dr. Arden, could you explain to us how fear is created and processed within the brain?
Well, there are a number of networks in the brain that have been highlighted by neuroscientists, and I want to draw your attention to a lot of really important research done by Joe Ledoux at NYU. He's spent a lot of time identifying various tracks through what is called the amygdala, so named because somebody back in 1820 thought it looked like an almond. So I know it sounds like a fancy term, but it's a series of clusters of neurons deep within your temporal lobes that act as a relevance detector. And not only for fear, but also for good things. But it's a black and white register. So if you were to encounter in your natural environment, let's say you're walking through a forest up in northern Montana, and you were to encounter a grizzly bear, your network of fear monitors, including the amygdala, would just hypercharge your networks, preparing you to do something like get out of there quick, or pumping you up with all these neural hormones to make your your muscles tense and getting ready to get out of there or do something. So that threat network is very, very important for all animals. However, sometimes it gets overactivated for people that experience fear when there is no need to experience fear.
Could you also, I know that you're not really into sort of these quick fix, which is sort of a modern temperament. And I know in your work you have a formula of five main factors that you explain to contribute to overall brain health and how to deal with certain things like fear. I believe you call it seeds, correct?
Right.
Yes, I was hoping that maybe you could explain that to us a little bit, maybe walk us through it a little bit.
Sure. So I didn't invent these five factors. What I did was organize them into a mnemonic because I'm very aware that all of us need some sort of quick way to remember. So the word seeds, SEEDS, encompasses those five brain healthy factors. So let me describe each and every one of them. And by the way, before I do, the reason I came up with the word seeds, the mnemonic seeds, is so we can all remember to plant and cultivate seeds throughout our life. And if we don't, we'll undermine our capacity to maintain a healthy, stable, and comfortable life that's not filled with unnecessary stress and wear and tear on the body and the brain. So seeds, the first S is social. So we know now that we are one of the most incredibly complicated social species on the planet. We develop all these social brain networks that thrive on positive relationships. And just to give you a flavor of how important this is, as hunter-gatherers up until about 11,000 years ago, we moved about 10 miles a day, and we moved in groups, in little clusters, clans. And so we worked together, and we could hunt animals much larger than us because of our social capacities. We gather, we enculturate our young. And these social brain networks that developed over a period of time give us the capacity to feel comfortable within ourselves, to feel safe, if, of course, our principal caregivers care for us in a very nurturing sort of way. And by the way, it's real important to understand that we are the species that are born most premature of any species because of our upright capacity. So we're born incredibly defenseless, carried around by our parents, and then thrive in this social environment as our brain matures. So these brain networks, when they're not activated, result in the dismantling of these networks that could provide us with a sense of safety and all that. We know, in fact, even there's epigenetic research that show that if not nurtured, the cortisol receptor gene on the hippocampus, for example, doesn't get developed, so we don't even have a thermostat for stress tolerance. One more thing, if I can pile in a little bit more neuroscience. We also know that if you don't get good social nurturance, that throughout a lifetime, that the capsule names of your chromosomes, called telomeres, actually shrink with bad quality social relationships or with loneliness. So the social factor, critically important. Next is the first E, exercise. And I was just noting that we move 10 miles a day as hunter-gatherers, and unfortunately, we don't move 10 miles a day now. Very few of us do that. And so in my former environment where I worked in the Kaiser Permanente system, we did this big conference in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and the person that spoke before me, who was a internal medicine professor from the University of British Columbia said that not exercising on a regular basis is worse than smoko-diabesity. In other words, it's a disability. So think of how important our movement, and I'm really talking about aerobic movement here, is critical to the longevity of the brain. It is the most powerful antidepressant that we have. If you don't move on a regular basis, you develop all these acquired lifestyle diseases, and we lead the world in them right now. Obesity, autoimmune disorders. So not moving on a regular basis is a disability. So it's, on the other hand, an incredible, powerful longevity behavior. So the second E of seeds is education. So if you're not learning something new on a regular basis, you're not building an infrastructure of connectivity in your brain. So you probably heard of the mantra that's now being used in popular culture to describe how the brain rewires. You know, neurons that fire together wire together. So really what that's all about is that the more complex thinking that you engage in, the more connectivity in the brain develops to support that complex thinking. And to put that in longevity terms, the more education you get throughout your life, the more connectivity in your brain you have. So later, when you start losing some neurons, let's say, the more you can lose without looking like you lost much, because you have more in reserve, or technically it's called cognitive reserve. So we know that people that are more highly educated and continue that education actually fare better in the brain health world.
So that would sort of fit under the use it or lose it category?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, we're really talking about use it or lose it throughout all the seeds factors, including the social factor that we were talking about initially. So you could have had really great social relationships early in life, but now you choose to be an island and go off by yourself and all that. So you're not using those networks anymore, and now they are deactivated, and you can even get shrinkage in various areas of the brain that I could babble on about, like the area that gives us the capacity for cognitive empathy and a number of other areas. But if I can continue with the D, and that's diet. And diet is fundamentally important and a problem for us in the U.S. in that our diet has become deplorable. So that we're now consuming huge amounts of simple carbohydrates, trans fatty acids, and as a result, changing our gut bacteria and creating all sorts of brain corrosive processes like advanced glycation end products, which is like the fast track to plaques and tangles. So we then develop a fast track to Alzheimer's disease. But on the way there, we develop a tendency towards dysphoria, lack of clear thinking, more prone to overreact to stressful stimuli, not enough energy. So basically our diet really provides us with the cornucopia of brain chemicals we call neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, and all that. And if you don't have a good diet, your brain chemistry gets all messed up. And even though you might be taking some of these medications that are within the so-called mental health world, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or whatever, these drugs don't make the neurotransmitters. Your body makes it via the food that you eat, and if you don't have the precursor amino acids to make the neurotransmitters, then the drugs don't even work, even when they do work. So that's diet. And one more factor I want to mention, and that's the last S of seeds, which is sleep. And it seems to be the case that in the United States we're getting increasingly less sleep, People are staying up later, looking at the computer screen, doing a lot of social media and all that, basically tricking the brain into thinking that it's daytime outside because the retina picks up light, signals the pineal gland. It's daytime outside, don't secrete the circadian rhythm hormone melatonin, so we're actually creating a little insomnia and a tendency not to get good quality deep architecture sleep, meaning good deep sleep, which is the most fundamentally important stage of sleep that boosts your immune system. And if you get deprivation in your stage 3/4 sleep, you're going to be more groggy and more depressed and more anxious the next day. So sleep hygiene is very, very important, and unfortunately many people are now taking over-the-counter drugs and drugs prescribed by their medical practitioner that actually mess up the sleep cycle, wiping out stage 4 sleep. So getting good sleep hygiene is not only important for the longevity of your brain, but also important so that you don't overreact to stress and unnecessarily fear things that you need not fear.
I know that you also work with anxiety and fear, and is there something that you could share with us that we could implement into our own lives that we can sort of deal with fear as it approaches us beyond the seeds method, sort of that daily? Because seeds sounds to me like that's a lifetime, it's a lifestyle.
Yes, absolutely. So, a series of very healthy behaviors that need to be in place, or you undermine your capacity to deal with stress, anxiety, and turn on the fear system and everything else. So with regard to helping people in my anxiety group that I led for about 10 years when I was at Kaiser Permanente, there are a number of different things that were part of the curriculum. So I've got to stress that the anxiety group that I led was in many ways a class. So I was always really stressing the importance of learning skills to deal with anxiety. So let me go through a few of them that I think are so important. And some of them, by the way, were identified very early on among the therapy style called cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's pretty clear that most anxiety disorders, or all anxiety disorders really, necessitate a certain amount of what is called exposure. I know that sounds kind of technical, but the bottom line is, when you fall off a horse, you get back on the horse. If you withdraw from the horse and avoid anything that makes you anxious, what you do is you end up painting yourself into the corner. And so let's talk real briefly about how the two sides of the brain deal with anxiety in a different sort of way. So you have two hemispheres, right? And it is pretty evident now that people that suffer from anxiety disorders tend to be more hyperactive, a little bit more activity going on in the right prefrontal cortex than the left prefrontal cortex. So think of this. When you avoid what makes you anxious, you actually, research has consistently shown, you end up being more anxious. And in fact, you end up looking for things that get you even more anxious, so you withdraw from them too, and you avoid them, and you get even more anxious, which turns on your right prefrontal cortex even more. So avoidance kicks on your right prefrontal cortex, making you overwhelmed with anxiety. And so what do you do about it? Well, actually, to balance out the activity of your two hemispheres, you need to actually do what is called approach behaviors. That means, in a sense, you step into it. And the AA and NA people have a lot of nice little jingles and little sayings and everything that really have some great wisdom to them. And one of them is fake it until you make it, act as if, and, one day at a time. And there was even a movie called What About Bob, baby steps. So if you're anxious about something, in particular, that is not anxiety-provoking, ultimately, from a realistic point of view, incrementally approaching that anxiety-provoking stimulus, whatever it might be, is actually beneficial to your dissolving that anxiety. And that is consistent with kicking on your left prefrontal cortex. Now, on the other hand, if you're going to be doing something that's stepping into anxiety that is actually dangerous, like, for example, one of the places that I've been in recent months has been in the Middle East, where we were teaching the aid workers of the Syrian refugees in the country of Jordan. And so I certainly wouldn't recommend any of this to the Syrian refugees. Why don't you go back to Syria? There's no problem there. That's ridiculous. You get a reality test here. But on the other hand, people can be really anxious about things like crossing bridges or being around people that they don't know and all that. Well, those aren't reality-based, like going back to Syria. So what we do with people with social phobia, for example, is incrementally help them step into it instead of away from people. And what that does is increase your comfort zones after a decrease of your comfort zone. So that's a real important point. It's easy to say exposure is the way to go because initially everybody gets more anxious when they do things that had previously made them anxious. But you've got to stay into it long enough for you to bust through the other side, for example. In other words, like we were just saying before, cells that fire together wire together, but initially they're not going to. They're going to make you feel more anxious. So let's say I'm a social phobic. I'm going to feel more anxious when I'm around new people until I gradually feel a little bit more comfortable. That's such a key part of this. You know, technical psychologists call it an extinction burst or whatever. You're always going to feel a little bit more anxious initially, but then gradually you're going to feel a little bit more comfortable, and if you keep on doing it, you gradually feel increasingly more comfortable.
Now, on the back end, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to my understanding that when you sort of address those and you do these little increments, you're actually on the, within the brain itself, you're actually rebuilding networks, correct? I mean, new neurological connections, getting rid of the old.
Absolutely, absolutely. So
that's why it takes so long.
Exactly. So we could say that anxiety, I know this sounds almost heartless, but anxiety is a bad habit. And what you've got to do is create some good habits. And the good habits are necessitating building new networks. The bad habits were networks that played over and over and over again. So more panic attacks you've had, the more likely to have a panic attack again. And so the more anxiety you had around being with people that make you feel uncomfortable, the more likely to have more anxiety later, especially if you withdraw and avoid. So what we're talking about is building new networks that support these healthy behaviors that initially are uncomfortable, but if you stay with it long enough, these networks get stronger, more durable, and more likely to be fired again when you do them again. Whatever that new habit might be, like, swinging a baseball bat to, hit the ball outside the infield or whatever. You go and you practice that. Well, initially you're going to be fouling the ball off left and right, and if you make contact at all. But then gradually you might make better contact and so on. The same goes for any kind of psychological behavior, like even studying for a test. What we want people to do when they're studying for an exam is study early and often, not cram the night before. And the studying early and often means that you're building in networks, you're practicing those networks, you're creating a whole large repertoire of versatility around those networks too. Same with any kind of psychological behavior.
Do you have any resources that you could share with us that might help us in overcoming our own fears?
Joe Ledoux at NYU, I would say that for people that want to learn more about anxiety, he just published a new book called Anxious that I thought was a really great summary of the neuroscience related to anxiety. Little less about practical methods and all that, but if you really want to understand the neuroscience behind a lot of the fear factor issues that we were just discussing. That's a really good book. There are a number of workbooks out there. I like to use my own, and I'm not saying it's any better than anybody else's, but there's a lot of great workbooks out there. I just happen to be more inclined to feel that people need to know some of the brain-based explanations for what's going on. So I wrote a book called the Brain-Based Anxiety Workbook that describes a lot of these factors that we were talking about, so that people understand that anxiety could be dissolved in time by strengthening some of the networks that are available to us, much like we were just talking.
And do you have any parting advice for us today?
Yeah, that I think that anxiety in general is probably one of the most prevalent psychological, you could say, challenges that most of us feel. And the reality is we do not want to ever have no anxiety because that means you're dead. And so a little bit of anxiety is not a bad thing. And in Western culture, certainly the United States, we've become so fearful of any kind of sensation. We want to narcotize it immediately. We want to do something to get rid of it. And so I think a healthy attitude is to embrace the anxiety and use it in a much more effective way. So that you can approach the day with a sense of challenge. So when you wake up in the morning, you don't want to have no anxiety. What you want to have is an appropriate level of it so you can get out to work on time, to deal with whatever challenges you have ahead of you. You just don't want to get so overwhelmed by it that you get incapacitated and start avoiding those challenges. So a lot of people do some pretty anxiety-provoking things from the perspective of other folks, like, for example, jumping out of airplanes or climbing mountains or whatever. Well, those people that do those major physical events call it fun, whereas other people go, oh, my God, I can't even look over the edge of a building. It drives me crazy. It's really the way you view things that is important, whether or not it's actually truly dangerous or not. So we live in a pretty safe environment, although I've got to say, if you don't mind me saying, it's we have too many gun outbreaks now, increasingly so. That's a problem, a whole subject of another discussion. But generally speaking, we don't live in Afghanistan, we don't live in Syria, and we have the opportunity to thrive in a generally healthy environment, and we can limit ourselves. And people suffering from anxiety disorders are actually doing just that, and they need not. There's hope.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Arden, for joining us today. It's been really amazing and so generous today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, it's a delight to talk to you, Billy. And congratulations for doing such a very, very valuable thing for a lot of folks out there that really need what you're offering them.
Thank you for joining me today. And remember, you cannot achieve everything, but you do have the God-given ability to achieve anything. So stay focused, out of fear, and keep on keeping on. Until next time, be well and peaceful. For more information on today's episode and guest, or for resources that will assist you in overcoming your fears, visit livingbeyondyourfears.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, where 3 times a week we move to a life beyond our fears.